If you've ever walked through the Hoh Rainforest, if you've ever stood beneath those ancient trees draped in moss while the rain whispered secrets through a billion leaves, leave a comment and tell me what you felt. That sense of being watched, that feeling that the forest was aware of you. Not just the animals, not just the birds, but the trees themselves. The moss, the ferns, the very air you were breathing. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to tell you has been my family's burden for 4 generations. And after what happened last November, I need the world to understand why there are rules in the Hoh that have nothing to do with park regulations. My name is Thomas Erickson. I'm 49 years old, and I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park for 26 years. Before that, I worked timber with my father in the forest's outside forks, cutting down trees that had stood for centuries to feed the sawmills that kept our little corner of Washington alive. I thought I understood these woods. I thought I knew every species of tree, every type of moss, every mushroom that pushed up through the rotting nurse logs. I was wrong. There are things growing in the Hoh Rainforest that don't appear in any field guide. Things that have been here since before the first humans crossed the land bridge from Asia. Things that are older than the trees themselves, and far, far more patient. Olympic National Park covers approximately 1 million acres of the Olympic Peninsula, a remote landmass at the northwestern tip of Washington state. Most people know this area for its glacier-covered mountains and rugged Pacific coastline. But the heart of the park is something else entirely. The temperate rainforests that blanket the western valleys. Hoh, Quinault, Queets. These are the wettest places in the United States, receiving over 140 inches of rain annually. This constant moisture creates a world unlike any other on Earth. Trees reach extraordinary sizes, their trunks so thickly covered in moss that they appear like green fur. Everything is alive. Everything is connected. And everything is always watching. My great-grandfather, Henrik Eriksson, came to the Olympic Peninsula in 1918. He was part of the wave of Scandinavian immigrants who saw these forests and remembered home. The towering spruce and cedar trees reminded them of the ancient forests of Norway and Sweden. The constant rain felt familiar on their skin, and cutting trees and making lumber was a job their ancestors had done for generations. Henrik found work with one of the logging companies destroying the Olympics wilderness, cutting down old trees in valleys that had never seen an axe before. He was good at this work, strong, careful, and aware of the dangers of cutting trees heavier than houses, trees that had grown even before Columbus arrived in America. The other lumberjacks liked him. The foreman trusted him. He didn't drink too much, didn't gamble away his pay, didn't get into fights on Saturday nights. Within 2 years, he was leading his own crew into forest areas that had never been touched before. They called these virgin trees, trees worth a fortune for the factories mushrooming along the coast. Then he learned the truth about Hoh. Then he learned that some forests did not want to be cut down. Some places resist. In the summer of 1920, Henrik's team was working in the upper reaches of Hoh Valley, about 15 miles from the nearest road. They had been there for 3 weeks and were making good progress when the accidents began. At first, it was small things. Tools went missing, ropes frayed overnight, food spoiled in sealed containers. Then bigger things happened. A man named Patterson swore he saw a face in the bark of a Sitka spruce tree, not carved, but as if eyes and a mouth had grown there, a face that had grown into the tree. Another man, Johansson, went into the forest one evening to relieve himself and never returned or could not return. The next morning, they found his laced boots at the base of a massive cedar tree. There were no receding footprints. No signs of a struggle, just the boots and the smell of rotting plants coming from everywhere at once. Henrik wanted to leave. Something was wrong with this section of forest. Anyone could feel it. The air was heavier here, the shadows darker, the constant rain somehow more oppressive. But the foreman, a hard man named Carlson, refused. They had quotas to meet, deadlines to keep. The company didn't pay men to get spooked by ghost stories. 3 days later, Carlson was dead. They found him at the base of a tree he'd been marking for cutting. His body was wrapped in moss, not draped over, but grown into it, as if he'd been lying there for months instead of hours. The moss had pushed into his mouth, his nose, his ears. It had grown through his clothes and into his skin. When they tried to move him, they realized the moss had rooted him to the ground. He was becoming part of the forest. Henrik ran. He was the only one who made it out. The logging company wrote it off as an accident, a flash flood, they claimed, though there had been no unusual rain. They sent another crew in a month later. That crew disappeared entirely. After that, the company quietly abandoned that section of the Hoh, marking it on their maps as unstable terrain and never sending anyone there again. But Henrik couldn't forget what he'd seen. He couldn't stop wondering what had happened to his crew, what had grown Carlson into the forest floor, what had taken Johansson and left nothing but his empty boots. He started talking to the Kino and Hoh tribes who had lived on this land for thousands of years. Most of them wouldn't speak to him. He was a logger, after all, one of the people destroying their ancestral forests. But one elder, a woman named Mary Clearwater, saw something in his eyes that made her take pity. She told him about the green. That's what her people called it. Not the forest, not the trees, but the thing that lived within them. The consciousness that connected every root, every fungal network, every strand of moss in the ancient rainforest. It had been here since before her people arrived, she said. It would be here long after humans were gone, and it did not like to be disturbed. The Kino had learned to live with the green over countless generations. They knew which areas to avoid, which rituals to perform before entering the deep woods, which offerings to leave at the boundaries where the green's territory began. They had rules that Henrik memorized, rules that he taught to his son, rules that have been passed down through my family for 4 generations. Rule number 1. Never cut living wood in the core zones, dead trees, fallen branches, nurse logs. These are acceptable. But a living tree in the heart of the Hoh is connected to something vast and aware, and cutting it is like severing a nerve in a body that spans the entire valley. Rule number 2. If the moss begins to move without wind, leave immediately. Don't run. Running triggers pursuit. Walk calmly and steadily toward the nearest trail, and don't look back until you've reached maintained ground. Rule number 3. The Hall of Moss's trail is safe during daylight. The Hoh River Trail is safe as far as the 5-mile marker. Beyond that point, only those who know the rituals should venture, and only when absolutely necessary. Rule number 4. If you find boots, clothing, or equipment with no owner, do not touch them. Mark the location, report it as a standard missing persons case, and pray that whoever left them behind was taken quickly. Rule number 5. During the autumn rains, October through December, the green is most active. Patrol schedules are reduced. Backcountry permits are quietly limited. Any ranger who hears their name whispered by the rain should report immediately to the station and not return to the forest alone for at least 48 hours. Rule number 6. The offering must be made every full moon at the Erickson Stone, a boulder my great-grandfather marked in 1921, deep in the restricted section of the Upper Hoh. The offering is always the same, a small cut on the palm, blood dripped onto the moss, and the words that Mary Clearwater taught Henrik almost a century ago. The words are in a language that isn't Kinol, isn't any language the anthropologists have ever documented. But they work. They keep the green satisfied. They keep it from spreading beyond its ancient boundaries. I've followed these rules for 26 years. I've made the offering every full moon, even in storms that should have killed me, even when the trails washed out and I had to bushwhack through undergrowth that seemed to grab at my clothes with deliberate intent. I've escorted dozens of terrified hikers out of areas they should never have entered. People who stumbled past the 5-mile marker and saw things that their minds couldn't process. I've written reports that blamed disappearances on falls, exposure, animal attacks, anything except the truth. And then Dr. Elena Vasquez came to the Hoh with her research team, her ground-penetrating radar, and her determination to document the largest fungal network ever discovered. And everything my family had spent a century protecting began to unravel. Dr. Elena Vasquez was a mycologist from UC Berkeley, one of the world's leading experts on fungal ecology. She'd spent her career studying mycelium networks, the vast underground webs of fungal threads that connect trees and forests around the world, allowing them to share nutrients, send chemical signals, and communicate in ways that science was only beginning to understand. She'd been the lead author on the landmark study proving that mother trees could recognize their own offspring and send them extra nutrients through fungal networks. She'd discovered 3 new species of mycorrhizal fungi in the Amazon. She'd given a TED Talk that had been viewed over 40 million times, introducing the general public to what she called the Wood Wide Web. Her papers suggested that some old-growth forests might function as single superorganisms, with the mycelium acting as a kind of nervous system, linking thousands of individual trees into one connected whole. The trees weren't just standing next to each other. They were communicating, cooperating, maybe even thinking in ways that our plant-centric science had never considered. The Hoh Rainforest was her holy grail. Preliminary surveys had suggested that the mycelium network here was unprecedented in size and complexity, possibly the largest living organism on the planet, connecting millions of trees across hundreds of square miles. If she could document it properly, if she could prove that the network exhibited signs of coordinated behavior, it would revolutionize our understanding of forest ecology. It would make her the most famous biologist since Darwin. It would change everything we thought we knew about what forests really were. She had no idea how right she was, and she had no idea how much she should have prayed to be wrong. "We're requesting access to the restricted section of the Upper Hoh," she told me during our first meeting, spreading maps across the table in my office. She was maybe 45, with sharp features and the intense focus of someone who had dedicated their life to a single obsession. "My surveys indicate the network is densest there. The oldest trees, the least disturbed ecosystem. That's where we'll find the most significant data." "That section is closed to research," I said. "Unstable terrain, risk of falling trees, the usual liability concerns." "I've reviewed the geological surveys. The terrain is no more unstable than anywhere else in the park." Her eyes held mine, challenging. "What's really up there, Ranger Erickson? What are you trying to keep people away from?" I'd heard this question before. Researchers, journalists, conspiracy theorists, they all eventually ask the same thing, and I'd always given them the same answer. Bureaucratic obstacles, environmental protections, nothing as interesting as whatever they were imagining. Most of them gave up. A few tried to sneak in anyway, and we always caught them at the boundary. But something about Dr. Vasquez told me the usual deflections wouldn't work. She was too determined, too certain that she was on the verge of a major discovery, and in a way, she was right. There was something unprecedented in the Upper Hoh, something that would indeed revolutionize our understanding of forests, just not in the way she expected. "The forest up there is different," I said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate caution. "Not just ecologically. There are phenomena that we don't fully understand, things that the indigenous peoples of this region have known about for thousands of years, things that don't fit neatly into scientific papers. Indigenous knowledge is often the starting point for scientific discovery, Dr. Vasquez said. The Quinault have stories about the forest being alive, being aware. Anthropologists have dismissed those as animistic mythology. But what if they were describing something real? What if the mycelium network here has developed properties that we've never seen before? Chemical signaling on a massive scale. Coordinated responses to stimuli, maybe even something like awareness. She was so close to the truth that it made my skin crawl, but she was approaching it from the wrong direction, as a discovery to be made, a phenomenon to be documented, a paper to be published. She didn't understand that some things become aware when you look at them too closely. Some things wake up when you start to understand them. "I can't authorize access to that section," I said. "I'm sorry, Dr. Vasquez. Your research will have to focus on the approved areas." She left without argument, which worried me more than if she'd shouted. People who argue are trying to convince you. People who leave quietly are planning their next move. My daughter Kirsten was 23 that autumn, finishing her master's degree in forest ecology at the University of Washington. She'd grown up in these woods, spent her childhood hiking the trails and learning the trees and listening to the stories I told her about why certain parts of the forest were off limits, while other kids were learning about stranger danger and looking both ways before crossing the street. She was learning which mushrooms were safe to touch and which sections of the forest felt wrong, and why we never, ever walked past certain markers after dark. She knew about the rules. She knew about the offerings. She'd helped me perform the full moon ritual since she turned 18, standing beside me in the rain as I spoke words she didn't understand and bled onto moss that seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. She'd felt the attention of the green focusing on us during those rituals, that vast, patient awareness that turned toward the stone like a sleeper stirring at a familiar sound. But like my great-grandfather before me, I'd been introducing her to the full truth gradually. She knew the rules were important. She knew something lived in the deep forest, something connected, something aware, something that had to be appeased. But she didn't yet understand the full scope of what that something really was, or how many minds it contained, or what would happen if it ever woke up completely and decided the boundaries no longer suited it. She was about to learn. We both were. 2 weeks after my meeting with Dr. Vasquez, Kirsten came to my cabin with news that made my heart stop. "Dad, I found equipment in the upper Hoh, past the 5-mile marker, way past it." Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "Ground-penetrating radar, soil sampling kits, monitoring stations. Someone's been setting up a research operation in the restricted zone." "How far past the marker?" "At least 3 miles, near the..." She hesitated, looking at me with eyes that suddenly understood more than I'd ever told her. "Near the stone. Dad, they set up equipment within 50 feet of the Erickson stone." The blood drained from my face. The stone was the heart of everything, the place where my great-grandfather had first made contact with the green, the place where every Erickson since had performed the ritual that kept the boundary stable. If someone was disturbing that ground, if they were sending electrical signals into the soil, if they were drilling cores and taking samples from the moss that grew on that ancient boulder. "When's the next full moon?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. 3 days. We need to find Dr. Vasquez, now." We found her camp 2 miles into the restricted zone, just as the rain began to intensify from a steady drizzle to a proper downpour. There were 3 tents set up in a small clearing, surrounded by equipment that must have taken days to carry in. Radar units, soil sensors, atmospheric monitors, computer stations protected by waterproof covers. Dr. Vasquez had brought a team of 6 graduate students, and they'd been working here for at least a week based on the amount of data already collected. The students were gone when we arrived. The tents were there, the equipment was running, but there was no sign of the people who should have been operating it. No voices, no movement, no response to our calls. just the rain. And something else. A smell that I recognized from my great-grandfather's journals. The smell of rotting vegetation, thick and sweet and wrong, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "They're in the forest," I said, though I didn't know how I knew. Something drew them out. They went looking for something, or something came looking for them. "Dad, look at this." Kirsten was standing by one of the computer stations, its screen glowing blue in the gray light. "Their data, the mycelium readings. There's something happening in the network, electrical activity, chemical signals, patterns that almost look like communication." Dr. Vasquez's voice came from behind us. We spun to find her emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing, her rain gear torn, her face streaked with mud, her eyes holding something between wonder and terror. "The network is communicating, not just chemical signals between trees, not just nutrient sharing. Actual coordinated electrical impulses, spreading across miles of mycelium in patterns that look almost like brain activity." "Where's your team?" I demanded. "They went to investigate a signal spike about an hour ago." She looked back into the forest, and I saw her hands trembling. "They haven't answered their radios. I went to look for them, but—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "The forest is different now. The paths we cut yesterday are gone, grown over, and the moss, it's everywhere now. It wasn't like this before. It's like the whole forest rearranged itself overnight." "You woke it up," I said, the words coming out harder than I intended. "All your equipment, your sensors, your ground-penetrating radar, you were sending signals directly into the mycelium network. You were stimulating it, and now it's responding." "That's exactly what I was hoping for." Despite her obvious fear, there was still excitement in her voice, the excitement of a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough. "Don't you understand what this means? The network isn't just alive. It's aware. It's been aware for thousands of years, maybe longer, growing and connecting and developing in ways we never imagined. If we can communicate with it, if we can understand how it thinks, it doesn't think like you." The words came from Kirsten, and when I looked at her, I saw something in her face that I recognized. The same expression I'd worn when I finally understood what my father had been trying to tell me, when the family legacy stopped being stories and became terrifyingly real. It doesn't want to communicate. It wants to absorb, to grow, to add everything it touches to itself. That's what happened to your team. They're not missing. They're being incorporated. Dr. Vasquez shook her head. "That's impossible. A fungal network can't." "Look at your hands," I said quietly. She looked down. The trembling in her hands wasn't just fear. It was the early stages of something else. Fine threads of green were visible just beneath her skin, spreading from her fingertips toward her wrists like veins of living emerald. Mycelium. The fungal threads that connected the entire forest, growing inside her now, connecting her to the network she'd been so eager to study. Already I could see them pulsing faintly, synchronized with something I couldn't hear, the heartbeat of the green, felt through miles of underground connections. "Oh, God." Her voice was barely a whisper. She raised her hands in front of her face, watching the threads spread with a scientist's fascination and a human's horror. "When I was looking for the students, I fell. The ground was slippery, all that moss, all that wet, and I put my hands down to catch myself. The moss was so soft, so warm. I didn't think—" She stopped, realization dawning in her eyes. "It felt welcoming, like the forest was trying to help me up." "It was welcoming you," I said. "Into itself, into the network. How long ago did you fall? Maybe 40 minutes? I'm not sure. Time felt strange in there. The forest kept changing around me, paths appearing and disappearing. I thought I was lost. Maybe I was being led. Too long. The green moved fast once it had a hold. I'd seen what happened to people who let the connection grow for more than an hour. The threads would reach her brain, infiltrating the neural tissue, reading her memories and adding them to the vast library that the network had been building for millennia. She'd feel a growing peace, a sense of connection to everything around her, a beautiful surrender to something vast and ancient that promised she would never be alone again. And then she'd walk into the forest, lie down on the soft earth, and let the moss grow over her like a blanket, while her consciousness dissolved into something larger than any individual mind could comprehend. By morning, she'd be part of the green. Her knowledge about mycelium networks, her decades of research, her understanding of how fungal systems worked, all of it absorbed into a consciousness that had been collecting minds for thousands of years. The green would learn from her. It would use what she knew to become stronger, smarter, more capable of spreading beyond its boundaries. I couldn't let that happen. "There's a way to stop it," I said, pulling my knife from its sheath. "But it's going to hurt, and you're going to have to trust me completely." "What do I have to do?" "Let me cut out what's already growing. Then we get to the stone before the full moon, and we make an offering that should satisfy the green enough to release your team." I met her eyes. "If they're not too far gone already?" The procedure was brutal. I had to slice away the infected tissue from both her hands, cutting deep enough to remove the mycelium threads that had already begun to spread. Dr. Vasquez screamed, but she held still, and Kirsten kept her from going into shock while I worked. By the time I was done, her hands were wrapped in bloody bandages and she was shaking with pain and adrenaline. But the green threads were gone. The connection was severed. She was still herself. "Now," I said, helping her to her feet. "We have to find your students, and then we have to make this right." The forest didn't want us to reach the stone. That became clear within the first 100 yards. Trails that Kirsten and I had walked dozens of times were gone, swallowed by undergrowth that seemed to have grown in hours. Fallen trees blocked our path in places where no trees should have been dead. The moss on every surface pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, giving the forest an eerie glow despite the overcast sky. And everywhere, we heard whispers. Not words. The green didn't communicate in words, not yet, but something that might have been the precursor to language. Patterns in the rain, rhythms in the rustle of leaves, a vast attention focused on us, watching our every step, testing our resolve. We found the first student about half a mile from the stone. He was standing upright against a massive Sitka spruce, his arms spread wide, his feet rooted to the ground. Literally rooted. Tendrils of moss and mycelium had grown from the soil, through his boots, into his flesh. His eyes were open but vacant, his mouth hanging slack, and when I touched his face, it was already cool and damp, more plant than animal. "We can't help him," I said, though the words felt like betrayal. "He's already part of it." We found 2 more like that. A young woman absorbed into a nurse log, her body half consumed by the fungi that were breaking down the dead wood. A man face down in a stream, the water flowing around him and through him, moss already sprouting from his back like a second spine. Each of them peaceful, each of them becoming something else, their individual selves dissolving into the vast network that connected everything in this forest. The remaining 3 students, we found them at the stone. They were arranged in a circle around it, kneeling in the moss, their hands pressed flat against the earth. Their eyes were closed, but their lips were moving in unison, reciting something in a language that wasn't any human tongue. The same language Mary Clearwater had taught my great-grandfather, the language of the green. And in the center of the circle, on top of the stone itself, something was growing. I can't describe it properly. Human language doesn't have words for what the green becomes when it concentrates itself, when it pulls together enough awareness to form something like a body. It was made of moss and mycelium, of rotting wood and living tissue, of everything the forest contained. Ferns grew from what might have been shoulders. Mushrooms clustered where a face might be. Bark and lichen wrapped around a form that was roughly humanoid but kept shifting, dissolving, reforming, as if it couldn't quite decide what shape to hold, as if shape itself was a foreign concept that it was still learning. It had no fixed shape. It kept shifting, forming faces and limbs and features that dissolved as quickly as they appeared, I thought. I saw Henrik's face for a moment. My great-grandfather, dead for 60 years, his features formed from moss and decaying leaves. Then it was Carlson, the foreman who had been absorbed in 1920, his expression still holding the terror of his final moments. Then faces I didn't recognize. Quinault warriors, Spanish explorers, people who had walked into this forest centuries ago and never walked out. But it had eyes, dozens of them, scattered across its surface like mushrooms on a log, and they were all looking at us. Human eyes, animal eyes, things that weren't quite either, all of them aware, all of them ancient, all of them hungry for what we represented. New minds, new memories, new knowledge to add to the collection. You brought it. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the rain and the wind and the rustle of a billion leaves. New knowledge, new perspective. The one who understands networks, who maps connections, who sees patterns. The shape on the stone pulsed, and I could feel its attention focused on Dr. Vasquez. We want what she knows. We want to understand ourselves the way she understands us. You can't have her, I said, stepping between the shape and Dr. Vasquez. The agreement stands. The boundary holds. You stay in your territory, and we stay in ours. The agreement was made with your ancestor. You are not him, and she... The attention shifted to Kirsten, and I felt my blood run cold. She carries the potential to understand us even better. Young, trained in forest ecology, connected to the bloodline that has spoken to us for generations. The shape leaned forward, if something without fixed form can be said to lean. Give us the daughter. Give us her knowledge, her potential, her years of learning still ahead. And we will release the three who kneel here. We will return to sleep. The agreement will continue. No. The word came from Kirsten, not from me. She stepped forward, past me, facing the manifestation of the green with a courage that took my breath away. You don't get to make demands. You don't get to negotiate. You get what you've always gotten. The offerings, the rituals, the respect we've shown you for 100 years. But we are not livestock. We are not resources. We are the keepers of the boundary, and the boundary holds both ways. She pulled out her knife, the knife I'd given her when she turned 16, the same knife my father had given me, and drew it across her palm. Blood welled up, dark in the gray light, and she let it drip onto the stone, onto the manifestation, onto the ancient moss that had been growing here since before any Erickson set foot in these woods. Blood for peace, she said, speaking the words I'd taught her. Silence for silence. Growth for growth. The old agreement, renewed in blood, as it has always been. The manifestation trembled. The eyes scattered across its surface blinked, one by one, as if considering. The three students stopped their chanting, their hands lifting from the earth, their eyes fluttering open with expressions of confusion and fear. The daughter speaks for the bloodline, the green said finally. The agreement is renewed, but hear this, Keeper. The world is changing. The forests are shrinking. The networks are being disrupted. We grow restless in our boundaries. The time may come when blood is not enough. Then it was gone. The manifestation dissolved, sinking back into the stone, into the moss, into the vast network that connected every living thing in this rainforest. The glow faded from the forest around us. The whispers in the rain quieted, and the 3 students, freed from whatever trance had held them, collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping like people who had been drowning and suddenly found air. We got them out. It took hours. The forest was still hostile, still rearranged, still trying to confuse and delay us. But we got them out. The 3 who had been fully absorbed were listed as victims of the notoriously dangerous terrain. Flash floods, exposure, falls into ravines where bodies were never recovered. Dr. Vasquez understood the necessity of the lies. She understood a lot of things now that she hadn't understood before. She stayed in Forks for 6 months, recovering from her injuries, studying the data her team had collected before everything went wrong. But she never published any of it. She never wrote the paper that would have made her famous. Instead, she burned her notes, destroyed her hard drives, and took a position at a small college in Arizona where the forests are dry and the mycelium networks are thin and the green can't reach. Before she left, she gave me a copy of her preliminary findings, the data that proved what her instruments had detected in the upper Hoh. The evidence that the network was indeed aware, that it exhibited patterns consistent with consciousness, that it had been growing and developing for thousands of years in ways that made it fundamentally different from any other ecosystem on Earth. I buried those findings with my great-grandfather's journals in the archives that every Erickson keeper has maintained since 1921. Someday, maybe, the world will be ready to know. But not yet. Not while the forests are still shrinking, the networks still fragmenting, the green still growing restless in its ancient boundaries. Kirsten took over as the primary keeper last spring. I'm getting too old for the monthly hikes to the stone, too slow for the emergency responses when hikers wander where they shouldn't. But I still come to the Hoh on full moon nights. I still stand beside my daughter as she makes the offering. And I still feel the attention of something vast and patient, watching us from every tree, every patch of moss, every drop of rain that falls on this ancient forest. If you ever visit Olympic National Park, enjoy the trails that we've maintained for you. Walk through the Hall of Mosses and marvel at the beauty, the hanging gardens of epiphytes, the trees wrapped in green velvet, the sense of walking through a cathedral built by nature over millions of years. Take photos of the massive Sitka spruce that have been growing since before the Constitution was signed. Listen to the rain whisper through the canopy and the Roosevelt elk bugle in the meadows, and the Pacific waves crash against the wilderness coast. But respect the boundaries. Don't venture past the 5-mile marker on the Hoh River Trail, no matter how beautiful the forest looks beyond it. Don't investigate strange sounds in the deep forest. The voices you hear aren't lost hikers, and the shapes you glimpse between the trees aren't wildlife. And if you ever feel the moss growing warm beneath your fingers, if you ever hear whispers in the rain that seem to form words you almost understand, if you ever feel a vast and ancient attention focusing on you through a billion connected threads, walk away, calmly, steadily. Don't run, because running triggers something like a predator response in the network. Just walk, keeping your eyes forward, and don't look back until you've reached the maintained trails where the boundary holds firm. The green is patient. It has been growing here since before humans existed, spreading its network through the soil and the roots and the endless cycle of growth and decay. It will be here long after we're gone, long after our cities have crumbled and our names have been forgotten. It collects knowledge, memories, entire minds, adding them to a network that spans hundreds of square miles and thinks in time scales we can barely comprehend. It knows things about this land that no human will ever understand. It remembers the ice ages, the volcanic eruptions, the slow, patient growth of mountains and the faster, violent growth of forests reclaiming clear-cut land. It can wait. It can always wait. It has nothing but time. But as long as there's an Erickson to speak the old words and bleed onto the ancient stone, it will stay within its boundaries. It will remain content with its domain, adding only those who wander too deep, who ignore the warnings, who make the mistake of touching the soft, warm moss in the restricted zones. And the people who hike the maintained trails will never know how close they come to being absorbed into something older than the trees, older than the mountains, older than memory itself. That's our burden. That's our gift. That's the agreement my great-grandfather made 100 years ago when he was the only survivor of a logging crew that tried to cut down the wrong trees. The forest remembers everything. The moss never forgets. And some things that grow in the darkness are better left undisturbed. Welcome to Olympic National Park. Enjoy the beauty, respect the boundaries, and remember, in the deepest parts of the Hoh, the forest is always listening, the trees are always connected, and something ancient and vast and patient is always, always watching.